Hello, Justin McCartney, Model 5 case study for AEP855 on January 13th, 2020. Quickly want to go over the summarization of how we got to this point. David and James were involved in a situation where James forced David to hold a piece of property that is a felony to possess. According to school policy, it is required to expel both students for a minimum of 45 days for their involvement in the situation. Mr. Inman had been spending extra time prior to this to kind of get to know the boys from the South Side and help them make a better name for themselves and get out of a situation that is a little there to be desired, I guess. This had been paying off in a positive manner. Mr. Inman had seen that there was a connection with the better grades and better personalities of the students. He had a disciplinary problem with James, so he called him to his office, and that's when everything had happened, where James had handed something off to David. The teacher that witnessed it thought it was possibly drugs, so both students were taken into Mr. Inman's office to talk about the problem. At that point, they found a pair of brass knuckles on on David, that James had later taken. He said that it was his brass knuckles, I guess. So they're both taken into custody after James confessed that it was his pair of brass knuckles and David for having possession of them. The school policy again states that both kids will be expelled for no less than 45 days. When Mr. Inman drew up the papers, he drew them up for James and then did not finish the paperwork for David because he felt like it was going to leave David and lead him into a path of something that wouldn't be good for him. 1 week later, David is back in school and James is at DAEP. The director of secondary education talks to Mr. Inman and tells him to file the paperwork for David's expulsion, or he would be written up for an official reprimand on his personal file. Here's kind of more of a breakdown of everybody involved and how they play a role in this. Mr. Inman is first-year assistant principal. James is the influential leader of a rough crowd and, at this point, a bully to David. David is an honor student. He has a clean record, no history of anything as far as being in the office for disciplinary actions. There's the teacher that witnessed, the police officer, and both parents and the director of secondary education. So the legal and ethical issues is that David's record is clean and his future is severely harmed by holding this weapon for James. Harassment had occurred when James threatened David if he did not hold the weapon. If Mr. Inman does not file the paperwork for David to be expelled, this would keep his record clean for school, and he could have the opportunity to get out of an unfortunate culture and make something of himself. This action contravenes school policy. It's also a breach of contract between the assistant principal and the school itself. Mr. Inman's decision to have the police in the room at the time of the meeting and have him pat down David has a big factor in this certain case. Had the officer not been in the room, I think Mr. Inman would have handled things a little bit differently. He might have resolved the situation for both students in a different way. Like I said, the officer being in the room played a major factor in that, and that's where the ethical versus legal issues kind of really make this case interesting. In a sentence, James has confessed to forcing David to be in possession of a felony weapon, and as the assistant principal, Mr. Inman is in the middle of an ethical dilemma to help prevent David from becoming another victim of an unfortunate situation. The facts are that it's unknown that James actually threatened David, or if he is just saying that to keep David from getting into trouble. Nobody really knows if the exact interaction between the two. It was just what James had said. All of our instincts, according to the story, lead us that it was a bullying act, that James had forced David into this, but that is not a proven thing. James is known for his tough personality and being a leader, but he's doing a better job of doing the right thing and took responsible for David getting in trouble, so I feel like that's a positive. David's future is not certain. With everything, he could still fall victim to the environment, but Mr. Inman does not want this certain situation to be that deciding factor. It is unknown how Mr. Inman would have handled the situation if the police officer had not been in the room during the meeting with the two students. I feel like his ethical stance to not expel David tells us that he might have handled it differently for both students. Outside of school, both students are going to be charged with felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. The result of that case is unknown. So what's at stake? The decision to punish one student but not the other could result in conflict within the community. By not punishing David, obviously, this could result in him not falling victim to the South Side. James is pretty likely to stay on the South Side and be an influence of that community, whether it turns out to be a positive or a negative manner. David's future is definitely pending the outcome of this situation. Mr. Inman also could have an official reprimand on his file, which could be a deciding factor later on in his career as well. And of course, James has another mark by his name as far as being charged with felony possession of a weapon. So I feel like not everyone has been really consulted. As head principal of the building, I was not consulted on what is to be done. The teacher who witnessed the exchange was not really consulted. She just called down and told what had happened. She was not brought in at any time really to give more reflection on the story. The police officer was initially there, but he was not followed up with, so we don't really know any more from him. Both parents were contacted after the incident, but were just given the details and not consulted really. Student counselors have not been involved either. I feel like they should have, or a student counselor should have some input on this, or at least be consulted. So what can I do as the building principal? I feel like I must demonstrate the capacity to evaluate the ethical dimensions of this issue, analyze the decisions in terms of established ethical frameworks, or communicate about the advocate for ethical and legal decisions with Mr. Inman first. I feel like I should first consult Mr. Inman and as his peer to discuss everything that had happened, kind of get the full rundown on the story. He has made a lot of choices himself that reflect on our entire team as a building, as a community. I feel like could learn more from the teacher who saw the interaction, and talk with counselors as well, and some of David's teachers as well. So quickly, 6 options for that I could do. I could first off do nothing and just let things pass. That is Mr. Inman's decision, so I can just not have a stance on it. Or I could take more liberal action and override Mr. Inman and expel David as the school policy states. I could also consult with Mr. Inman and discuss details of his actions and the ethical and legal decision he made without consulting anyone else. I could have a meeting with all parties involved and just have everybody in the room to hash out all the details. Consulting all the parties individually, I could also do that, or do it in small groups. So we could talk about taking no action whatsoever. If no one, or if I do not do anything, it would be unclear on where I stand on the situation ethically and legally. My assistant principal wouldn't know where I stand, if I stand behind him or I disagree with his decision, either one. The school board might question why I didn't get involved. By not making a decision, teachers and other administrators might see me differently and think I'm less likely to support them or be worried that I won't do anything. By taking the comprehensive approach, I would be overstepping Mr. Inman in his decisions. And by taking matters into my own hands, I could possibly not have a written reprimand for Mr. Inman on his file for his ethical stance, and students' future could change in a negative manner. Number 3, consulting Mr. Inman, I could talk with him up front and get a full understanding of his ethical stance on the situation and why he made that. Having this discussion will also let him know where I stand as his peer. We could also have Mr. Inman change his mind on expelling David and go back to the school policy. But hopefully we'll take a team approach to this and on this situation and future situations. Then his ethical stance might stay intact and the proper legal decision can be made. I could have a meeting with all parties involved. We could talk with everybody. The hostility could get out of hand. Nothing could get resolved. James's parents might discover that David was not punished and really push for him to be expelled, or to reverse James's expulsion, I guess would also be a possibility that they would push for. More information could be presented if we all get together and sit down and talk about it. A possible solution could possibly present itself at that point. Seeing all parties could make Mr. Inman realize his ethical decision was for the best was for the best, or it may make him change his mind. Finally, the individual, I could talk with everybody individually or in small groups. This would, consulting parents would give them more of an understanding of the dilemma Mr. Inman is in, and Mr. Inman can model ethical behavior on his personal conduct in relationship with the two students, meaning he could talk the positives of how James had acted and everything like that. Consulting James's parents could give the opportunity to show appreciation for James' behavior, like I said. That will cultivate ethical behavior in James. So the best option, I feel like, would be for me to talk with Mr. Inman right off the bat, and we could discuss the situation. This would allow us to have the opportunity to discuss his decision as an individual and his impact on the school and team members, and discover the ethical and legal aspects of the case. I would start by sitting down with him and talking to him about what his decision was and how he got to that conclusion. After the decision, I would tell him where I stand ethically and legally and why. I would then discuss with him the missing information on how to possibly gather information and point out how to do it from a team perspective. At this point, I would help Mr. Inman gather more information by talking to the teacher that witnessed, counselors, and the police officer. I would encourage him to come in and meet with Mr. Inman myself and their child to completely understand the situation. I would finish by consulting the administrator of secondary education, followed by letting that person know where we stand, where I stand on the matter, and where we will be moving forward as a school. So finally, right quick, here's my NELP standard.